Mario is the face of Nintendo, and as such, his games can be very experimental at times. This is very prominent in a lot of his spin-off titles, but can also be seen in some of his more mainstreamed ones. The 3D Mario titles, for example, while starting as open-world games, eventually took a more linear focus before Super Mario Odyssey brought back the old sandbox style. All of these titles also contain numerous different gimmicks, movesets, enemies, and environments which could be considered experimental as well, but perhaps the oddest of these ideas brought about by Nintendo was the defining gimmick of Super Mario Sunshine, F.L.U.D, the Flash Liquidizer Ultra Dowsing device. While by no means a perfect game, constantly being plagued by arguments regarding its often wonky controls, frustrating level design, and strange mechanics, the title's primary attribute, at least in my opinion, was executed very well. Isle Delfino, though not my favorite world to explore, provided a tropical backdrop which fit perfectly with the implementation of F.L.U.D. Being a device with the sole purpose of spouting water, the machine needs a constant supply of water, which is far from a burden as the entire game takes place on an island. This idea to create a world which so effectively worked to emphasize its game's main mechanic is what initially piqued my curiosity and inspired me to play Sunshine despite its critiques. And F.L.U.D's ability to expand on the already extensive moveset established in Super Mario 64 through the usage of numerous different maneuvers and nozzles is what kept me playing even through the most infuriating of levels. F.L.U.D's many abilities are gradually unlocked and uncovered as the game progresses. However, even when the player first begins their journey and are only granted usage of 2 of the 4 nozzles, their options are still quite expansive.
Of these 2 nozzles, the arguably more important one is the squirt nozzle. Despite initially appearing rather basic, as its primary purpose is to squirt some water in whichever general direction Mario is facing, this one nozzle actually houses many other abilities. Of course, there's the simple spray technique, which can be used to damage certain enemies and bosses, but there are also more advanced techniques such as precise first-person aiming of F.L.U.D's stream, a blast of liquid which covers a large range in front of Mario, and a spin spray which covers a 360-degree radius around the player and is particularly useful against the Phantom Manta boss. These basic maneuvers already add another layer of depth to Mario's moveset, but the squirt nozzle has even more uses if its wielder can get creative enough. If a player is suspended over water via a leaf or boat, they can spray water in one direction and use the force from said action to propel themselves in the opposite. The physics of this move aren't entirely accurate, but it's still a unique and fun way to get even more usage out of a seemingly simplistic nozzle. Above all else, however, for me the squirt nozzle excels most when used to gain speed. If a player soaks the ground in front of them and then proceeds to dive forwards towards the area they've sprayed, Mario's slippery, frictionless body will slide at an unmatched speed until it makes contact with something or the player jumps. This maneuver in specific was one that shocked me when I first discovered it, but it's such a useful and addicting addition. The first nozzle the player becomes acquainted with is not only the most versatile, but easily the most enjoyable to use. And while the others hardly come close to topping it, the squirt nozzle's easy to learn and difficult to master control scheme was very effective in helping me adjust to Sunshine's quirky controls, and had me longing to find out what was in store with the other nozzles. It's also worth noting that a new player will most likely be using F.L.U.D's abilities rather haphazardly, which is a good thing, as because of this they'll learn very early on that they should refill their machine whenever the opportunity presents itself, as the seemingly endless plots of colored ink scattered around the island can prove inconvenient or at worst, fatal, and having a steady supply of water provides a reliable solution for getting rid of the hazardous substance.
The other nozzle the player begins their journey with is going to be saved for later. For now, I'd like to get the 2 lesser utilized, though still very entertaining nozzles out of the way, starting with the rocket nozzle.
Its name being rather self-explanatory, this nozzle allows Mario to launch high into the sky, releasing a lot of water while doing so. Upon reaching the peak of their launch, the player can choose to fall down lightly or barrel into the ground with as much speed as they had going up, although the latter option is hardly useful outside of the game's final battle. These 2 actions are all that this particular nozzle can be used for, but though it's far less complex than the others, it can still be fun to utilize. Areas with vertically oriented terrain and obstacles, such as Noki Bay, can be difficult to scale without usage of the rocket nozzle, but with it, though successfully landing on some of the thinner ropes and platforms can still prove challenging, the climb can be made far more reasonable. The second of these lesser nozzles is the turbo nozzle. Like the former, this one isn't used for very much. It propels Mario forward at an extremely fast pace, and though this allows him to make some larger jumps and crash through certain walls, it's very difficult to control. And with how much water it requires compared to simply performing a slide using the squirt nozzle, the turbo nozzle doesn't feel like a very necessary addition. I mentioned earlier that I think F.L.U.D. was a great mechanic, and yet the last two nozzles I've mentioned have been described as fairly lackluster, but those two were only required for very small portions of the game, which is why their implementation doesn't bother me very much. The hover nozzle, however, is always useful for something. As its name implies, this gadget grants F.L.U.D. a jetpack add-on which allows Mario to hover for a short period of time. This hover can be used to gain horizontal distance necessary for clearing long gaps, or vertical distance required for grabbing onto a high ledge. If used underwater, it can actually propel its user upward. This nozzle, while still not the most versatile, is extremely helpful. If a player misses a jump with quick enough reflexes, they can hover back to safety. Combined with a somersault, spin jump, or wall jump, the hover nozzle can allow Mario to achieve some truly impressive maneuvers. The water released from F.L.U.D. while hovering can even be used to clear a landing for Mario if he's over ink. Though nowhere near as flexible as the squirt nozzle, F.L.U.D.'s hovering ability is a very well implemented feature, and its constant flow of opportunities to prove its helpfulness easily make up for the simplistic nature of the turbo and rocket nozzles.
Considering that F.L.U.D. was such a strange experimental gimmick implemented when 3D Mario games were still relatively new, it was implemented surprisingly well compared to many other aspects of the game.
While not perfect, the robot's capabilities shined so brightly within this title. F.L.U.D.'s numerous abilities were able to take the already fantastic moveset that Mario was gifted in Super Mario 64 and expand upon it in some strange albeit satisfying ways. In a game where so many factors seemed entirely out of my control, it felt so wonderful to slowly perfect Mario's movements, and having F.L.U.D. to open up even more options in the forms of hovering, sliding, and spraying provided a steady learning curve that felt so rewarding to scale. Personally, I would love to see Nintendo attempt to create another title with a gimmick as wacky as F.L.U.D., just without the massive watermelons, and the sandbird, and the cryptically hidden blue coins, and the pachinko machine, and the chucksters, and the lily pad ride, and the boat ride, and the other boat ride, and the...